Welcome to the Safety Doc Podcast with your charismatic host and prominent safety expert, Dr. David Perodin. Be entertained and informed as the Safety Doc discusses both best and bizarre practices in safety preparation and crisis response. The truth will keep you safe. Follow Dr. Perodin on Twitter at SafetyPhD.
Hi, this is David from the Safety Doc Podcast, and today we are going to do something pretty incredible. You know, we haven't done this on the Safety Doc before. We are doing a collaborative podcast with Elijah from Nerdy by Nature. So,
hi.
Hey, Elijah, welcome.
Thanks, David. Appreciate it.
So this is also the bridging of Canada, where Elijah's at right now, and the United States. So we're powering North America together to do this podcast.
The North American podcast,
Yes.
Safety Doc, Nerdy by Nature. It's a good time.
Who would have thought this would have happened like a year ago? Like nobody. And all of a sudden it's happening. And I know it's
awesome.
It's trending on Twitter right now. As at least it's 7, 8 hashtags deep right now. People are like, I can't believe this is happening. When will this be live? So
win it, in it to win it, podcast forever, whatever it is. Yeah.
So history in the making. So
good.
So just a little bit about my podcast, and then
Sure.
I'll have Elijah talk about Nerdy by Nature. Now, I'm a fan of Nerdy by Nature.
Thank you.
I love the exploration of the lesser known but very relevant points in history and science. And we had talked just beforehand of, like, I believe it was the Qin Dynasty in China, and the acres and acres buried of clay soldiers and just but with the Safety Doc podcast, I focus largely on physical safety, agency and purpose, situational awareness, and have presented on a number of topics in that realm, and have also interviewed people, including a blind man for 65 years who talked about safety and had some very entertaining stories, in addition to heart-touching stories to share with that. A lady who is in her mid-20s and has traveled already 12 or 14 times to Haiti and has done humanitarian work, and gave a lot of behind-the-scenes things, like the time she broke up a bar fight when she was like 17 years old and somebody had a knife, and all of these things. So I'm like, whoa.
It's a lot of life experience for 20. That's for sure.
Yeah. And I'm like, it was right after I got back from Disney Orlando. I drove my family down. So I'm like, I just went to 5 new states, and she's been to, like almost every country in the world. And I'm like,
look bad,
hey? It was funny. She was a terrific guest, and talked a lot about the Travel Safe program, which is free, available to all citizens of the United States. So yeah, that's what we do on the Safety Doc. And
awesome.
I've been a fan of Nerdy by Nature and Elijah, your work, and it just happened to come about where we could do this show. So tell us about Nerdy by Nature.
Sure. Thanks, David. Been about a year going on now, and you're right, kind of dive into things, and the whole premise and play on words is to kind of get nerdy about topics and dive in a little bit without putting you to sleep, I guess you could say, to hit those points and kind of a high level, I guess, for half an hour, and kind of hit some points and get you enough interested. And then if you want more, you can always research Google or hit the blog or what you like. Different topics we do is mostly science, as you said, and we'll take care of old ancient histories and explore the Bermuda Triangle or discover Atlantis, try and figure that out. And then there's other topics we'll kind of jump into, a bit of tech or Skynet, or even Space Odyssey 2001. That was a good one.
It was.
For sure.
It was, yeah. I remember.
For sure. Yes. And even things like Legion, and the one coming up, the Stranger Things, is a great show we love too. So I don't know if you've seen it, but it's a bunch of kids playing D&D in the 80s and kind of just talking about the whole Dungeons & Dragons premise, and kind of make it into, I guess, for yourself, talking about safety. Definitely have to watch out what dimension you're in before you get too carried away.
Yeah. I played Dungeons & Dragons back on my Intellivision years
Really?
ago. So yes. And I remember you could hear the little hissing of the dragon as you go around the corner and be like, okay, get my arrows ready.
That's right.
This is it.
Roll some dice, hope for the best.
Yeah.
That's good. Yeah. Not afraid of being who you are. I guess that's kind of how it is for both of us. You call out different things psychology wise. I call it different things, and maybe some anxiety, depression. So it kind of crosses over. So it works out.
Yeah. And we've worked together on putting together talking points for today, but this show is going to probably go in a lot of different directions. And
Right.
And I think for people listening in, they're going to appreciate once we kind of merge our two knowledge bases, what's going to come out of this. So,
Hope so.
So Elijah, if you can maybe get us rolling with a discussion on ancient civilizations, so maybe building from the ground up this discussion.
Absolutely. I know we were talking about different things before to prep, and we were kind of getting into society in general, and to kind of come to the idea that ancient civilizations aren't really that far off from today, which is interesting. Getting back into that first Chinese emperor Qin, or Qin, pardon me. He was big into slavery. He was big into high standards, and he was big into making his people do things that they didn't necessarily want to do, but they wanted to live. So that was their purpose and
Right.
their drive. Interestingly enough, it wasn't, say, gold pieces or silver pieces. It was just, if you don't have this perfect standard, you'll actually get tortured or hanged. So, and the whole, he couldn't watch everybody. So what he did was he went to people, and they had little blocks of neighborhoods, let's call them.
Okay.
And within these neighborhoods, there was one person, kind of like a neighborhood watch person, and the whole neighborhood was responsible for ratting each other out if somebody was bad. So the whole mentality was kind of just Big Brother is there, but you're watching everybody else to make sure that your neighbor is doing good things, and to maintain this high standard. If you didn't, and you were caught, say, friending or hiding something, or playing this game, then you would be tortured, and the whole neighborhood would be penalized. So the interesting thing is that not just one person was penalized, but if you don't play nice together, or you try to be cohorts in some sort of, criminal activity, or just not being perfect, then the whole neighborhood goes. You kind of see a lot of that today, where everybody's kind of careful and watching a neighborhood watch, which
Yes.
is interesting. And then you kind of come back to where everybody was really proud. Everybody's into religion and looking for a higher power, a higher purpose, which was kind of neat too. It also, with the old Chinese cultures, they would be big in the afterlife. So there was a lot of value in human life into purpose and what would happen after, which is interesting. Kind of like religion and Christianity and Catholicism, Muslims now. A lot of people did different things to decorate their bodies and make those tombs that we were talking about, with 300-pound statues of chariot fighters or warriors, or just people that were, protecting the emperor from the afterlife. He was so worried about the negative stuff that he did, that he had this 10,000 football field of this underground statues, and it was just incredible. It was all this because he was worried about getting stung in the afterlife. Some ghost or other creature would come and get him, and that's
Right.
the only purpose for that. So leaders then were completely selfish and didn't care. There was no heartfelt appreciation for human life. But on the other hand, there was when you're talking about the afterlife. So it was kind of just really interesting mix, I guess you could say. Yeah.
As you speak about that, it reminds me of reading the book Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And Viktor Frankl was a neuroscientist who was a prisoner at Auschwitz during World War II.
Oh, okay.
And he talked about, you talked about the neighborhood watch, and basically the concept for the prisoners was that certain prisoners would be picked and identified as capos, C-A-P-O-S. And then your responsibility as a capos would be to look after the other prisoners, like in your barrack, for example.
Okay.
And as long as everything was fine, and everything meaning if there was a piece of straw from the wooden bunks that was on the floor, you could be beaten and lose your rank as capos for that. So
Really?
it's amazing. So Victor talks about how somebody that you knew, for several weeks or whatever, if they got promoted into this capo's role, quote unquote, promoted, they turned nasty because it was a way out for them. I mean, it was a likelihood that they would survive. They'd get a little better food, a little better ration, not much, but then they had to be nasty toward their own and absolutely rat out. And so in some aspects, he wrote, and I've read this in other works pertaining to the Nazi prison camps, it was actually the prisoners who were promoted into quote unquote pseudo guard roles who were the nastiest, who were more nasty than the SS. And I think that's a real interesting part of psychology to look at, how you can identify your need for survival and this path to survival and instantly turn on your own, quote unquote, your own. I mean, people that you had befriended, people it might have been from your neighborhood and so forth. So, that's, I kind of, that parallel jumped out right away.
Interesting, because it almost seems like there's a class structure being developed in that story where there'd be the guard that may be a little more well off or more important, or maybe his ego was just inflated to make it seem like he was somebody more important. And then there'd be this peasant or this a criminal that's kind of looked upon as, I don't know, at the scum of the earth, so to speak. So it's kind of interesting how that works out. And that whether you talk about Chinese or Greek or Egyptians, or even if you go way back to Incas in South America, it's always been a class system where somebody's always been more important. You go jump into Cleopatra's day where there was inventors in the Greeks and they were more important, doctors and so on. Or you go back to in East Indian culture where there was physicists in, I think, 900, say BC, but that was a while back. So jumping around a bit, and I know I'm going back and forth and kind of time shifting here on you, but there's, no matter what culture you go to, there's always a class system. And then we take it to now, talking about World War II and 1800, 1900s, 20th century, 21st century, there's still a class system. And it's even worse now, I would say, that people are more well off or more poor. There's this big variance, and it's kind of scary. But it's taken a couple thousand years to develop this wide gap in the human race.
Yeah. I completely agree with that. This extreme, either you're very wealthy and you have access to resources, and then also not only that, the producer of the comic strip Dilbert, and I can't think of his name right now, and I regret that, but I listened to a few presentations that he had given, and basically he said, I'm well off. I could easily just create my own bubble and remove myself from society. And he said, I'll never do that. I still do my own laundry. He's like, I don't want to lose touch with what it is to be, be a part of society. But yet, like so many people have, and the, it's you're right. These polar Scott Adams, that just came to me somehow, Elijah. I don't know how. But
Wikipedia got 1 million hits, I'm sure of it. So good.
But yeah, Scott Adams is phenomenal to listen to. I mean, he's extremely introspective and talks about the art of persuasion. He's also trained as a hypnotist.
Really?
But yeah, so but it was amazing. He talked, and the one thing it just stuck out with me, he said, I always do my laundry. Like I feel that is my connection back into reality. But and I think we'll get into this a little bit further into our discussion, later on, of like, what is AI, artificial intelligence, and I watched the movie just a few days ago that had to do what was it, HAL 3000, and then I, Robot with Will Smith. Of what it really would be like, if it's 75 years from now and we walk around and there are, either human,
cyborgs and
cyborgs or completely robotic entities who are around us. And what does that mean for a class, system? And I think, just to forecast, we're going to get into things like universal, basic income and what that might mean and how people derive sense of agency and purpose. And I think I'm actually pretty scared about about that. So,
when you talk about purpose, David, it kind of reminds me of, I believe it's Greek culture, where they had colosseums and horses and jousting and things like that. And not necessarily just clowns or entertainment, but people are forced as sometimes slaves to go out into the Colosseum to be able to perform for the rich. And you were forced to go into the battle of the death.
Yes.
Where people that you're talking about purpose, you don't have purpose. Your sole purpose in life is to entertain the rich. Almost like in modern days where you go on the internet and you bet on somebody or something like that, or horse races, where back then it was, a big glass of ale and having a good time in these big colosseums. But interestingly enough, these people that were jousting or battling to the death, they didn't have a choice. They just kind of chain link and off you go.
Yeah. It kind of reminds me of, for example, in Milwaukee, not too far from here, they voted to build a new arena for the Milwaukee Bucks basketball franchise, and 50% of it is publicly funded. So it's people paying a tax to build an arena, which is a palace, be completely, state of the art with the biggest scoreboard for an arena in the world when it's done next year. But it's one of those things too, where a lot of the people who are taxed to pay for this will never have any type of direct or ancillary benefit from that. But yet, it is this, I guess, imposing of the building of the Colosseum and kind of more indirectly, the funding of the performers in the Colosseum. Wow.
So I guess if you're talking about different things that people are doing in the Colosseum, and you really have, I don't know, back to that force mentality where people don't have a say in what governments are doing, right? So you're basically the government saying in this case that you pay taxes, and this is how much the taxes are allocated to. But if you have AI or something to that effect, perhaps the intelligent beings, if you will, are going to be able to predict what taxes will be like, what people will pay for, or even they'll be able to figure out more of a detailed system. Say it's instead of 1% goes to here, maybe it's decimal 7,000 or something to that effect, where just a little bit needs to go here, and perhaps they can make the most of our money more efficiently. As you know, today, governments aren't that great at being efficient and kind of wasteful. So
right.
You never know if that would kind of bode better, or maybe there's a better purpose than the Colosseum and or what have you. Maybe it's roads or technology, or maybe it's just getting out of coal and going to more efficient electricity. Who knows?
The prioritization matrix in government of figuring out what is the I guess the appropriate priority set to allocate funding to. When I did my presentation on public television following the 2012 Sandy Hook massacre, which was a massive shooting with fatalities at an elementary school, in eastern coast United States. But an interesting aspect of that from a policy standpoint is within 6 months following that, there were 450 bills that came out across the United States on ways to improve school safety. Wow. And with those came some pretty substantial price tags. But Elijah, of those bills, almost all of them were for fortifying the school environment. And while those address some of the direct causes, like having entryways where you have to be buzzed in, and then there's a secondary area where you have to be buzzed in from and show some security and stuff. And I talk about this and I write about this. If those things are very marginally effective, I mean, there are things such as, you can harden one target, but you soften another target. So the playground then becomes a soft target. The bus pickup becomes a soft target because you don't have those types of security at those locations. Right. But as I analyze these bills, the root causes of issues that lead to, for example, school shootings, one is mental health, and a second root cause is that you're not developing effective threat input systems. They're complex. Kids don't understand them. Kids aren't trained on them. So those are research proven. And the NFL, for example, National Football League, I did a presentation with their security branch. They've gone to an app-based incident management system. And the NFL is, in charge of every stadium of maybe 70, 80,000 people, keeping that stadium safe during this game. And they do. But I looked at these bills and some of them were absolutely ridiculous. And it's rhetoric. It's public forums where people come in and say, we want to see schools without windows because I'm like, well, there was a study, the Hishong Mahone study that was done on the West Coast of the United States over a number of years, correlating the benefits of sunlight to academic performance and actually overall social performance and attendance and things like that. People don't want to hear about it. It's like, nope. So what you're talking about, and I'd like to hear, hear you take this apart. So sure. Artificial intelligence, right now, after, for example, that school shooting, you get 450 bills. Most of them are completely ridiculous, and most of them just faded away. It's people coming out and they're frightened. They don't know what to do, but they can see a security guard, they can see a steel door, they can do things like that. It's visible, it's tangible to them, and they think this is the answer. And they don't want to listen to research. You can put the research out there, and it's like they don't even want to hear it. And actually, it's not that they'll say cordially they don't want to hear the research. It's like, be quiet. We don't care. This is what we want. And I'm like, and I did school consulting with safety for a while, and I kind of evolved out of that, just working with some companies and looking at more interface systems and things like that, because the schools, it was just so overpowering, the communities and the school boards of whatever they wanted. If you came in with research, if the research supported what they wanted, that was great. If it didn't, then it was completely, tossed to the side. So how do you see that this what happened after Sandy Hook, with these 450 bills, these knee-jerk reactions, and all of these bills, millions of dollars in time, and people just, how does AI come in and help to make that a better process?
Good question. I think that government officials just have to react to the situation and react the best they can to make sure that they feel that the public has trust in them. And if they don't react appropriately, like you said, then out come the pitchforks and the flames and shotguns or whatever, and people running around throwing chairs around. They're upset and they want action. Like you said, I demand this, but people don't always know what's right for them. And that's why there's those people in place to take care of the safety. But there's a whole lot of emotion that goes into this. And I really think that AI could take out the emotion. If we don't program AI to have the emotional set or to target a certain, say, a race, if you will, then we should be okay to have impartial view of what happens, and that to be able to take the mathematical formulas that AI can do and to just squish apart the 450 bills and make them efficient without the rhetoric or the feeling or the emotion, then on one side it could be really great, but on the other side it could be too efficient in operational sense. So you won't have that feeling and then perhaps the people won't trust in their political advisors. So catch-22, the emotional piece is helpful, but if you're having these knee-jerk reactions, then those 450 bills, like you said, could be half of them a waste of time.
Right.
Not really a concrete answer. I can't predict the future, but I think it would be more useful and impartial, and to take away that we want this kind of demand. We know what's best for us, to have someone or something that doesn't know how to think like a human, that just thinks about the facts and then worries about nothing else.
So,
see what happens.
So also, what is AI? And I've struggled with this because I think people look for a leader, and right. I watched the Lego movie, and Emmett is the chosen. Right. And Emmett, of course, in this movie, is just a typical construction worker, and it's the movie line of just the ordinary person that gets put into the hero role, and then they emerge to fulfill that role, with some tacit knowledge or abilities that they didn't know were there. And sure. Part of it is, I think when people believe in you, they will follow you, even if it's even if what you're saying isn't rational. I mean, we've seen this with cults and things like that, where people have followed.
Well, Hitler's a perfect example. I don't want to bring up terrible history, but
yeah.
that's case in point, where all the nonsense that came out of his mouth about racism and say halfway to slavery, you have a great punchline and a salute and a terrific mustache, and then people are yours forever. It's wild. And that's case in point to what you're saying.
It is. I remember reading about when Hitler would give speeches, and afterwards, and the front rows would be, it was like a Justin Bieber concert. It would be all of the 15, 16-year-old German girls, and they adored him, and they would write him, letters saying, please marry me. And these marriage proposals he had from 15 and 16-year-old girls who were just enamored by his charisma. And I think, this vesting in a charismatic leader. I interviewed somebody who responded, and actually it's two people who've done this over time, but who were first on the scene to a car crash, and then during this car crash had gone into action to try to save somebody from a burning vehicle or something, and then bystanders would come by, and what they would do, so that the person who was initially trying to respond to this, he said the bystanders would kind of stand there and not know how to interface into the situation, and the one person, Kevin, just said, you need to do this, 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 and the people did it, and it was amazing. And the other person I had spoken with, it was kind of the same thing. He's like, you need to get on the road and make sure that you're steering traffic here. I mean, and it wasn't previous training that they had. It was just, as soon as somebody gave directives, people followed, and people looked to that. And my question, as I watch like I, Robot with Will Smith, and there are others, and we've talked about those, and I'd like you to talk about some of the movies, that we had mentioned that were very significant with artificial intelligence. But I'm not sure. I mean, I can see both ways. I can see a society willing to hand over some. I'm willing to follow this AI. I don't know if you call it entity or being or algorithm or whatever it would be. On the other hand, it's like, there's absolutely no way I'm going to do that. And then what happens if AI makes a mistake? Because I don't think society would be very forgiving if there was some AI mistake that happened. And then there were there's so much in context and situation. Let's say like there's a massive, there's a dam that's fragile, and the AI, interface down the road is looking at calculations and so forth, and all of taking in data and saying, the situation doesn't require an evacuation. And then all of a sudden there's an earthquake and the dam collapses. Well, the AI model could not have predicted this unforeseen variable. I mean, it wasn't a data set that was available. So then people are like, it was the AI model that killed 2,000 people. And, it's the same thing of Pitchfork, the computer, until the last, remnants of the solid state drive are shattered. So how do you see that? Because I struggle with trying to understand. It's almost like religion to some extent, because you have to have this faith and this belief in either an entity, or if it even is this hierarchy of some type of management system within the universe. So maybe it parallels there. I don't know.
It's kind of interesting because people don't understand the technology, so they assume it's perfect. It's a computer. It's a marvel. It's amazing. This is great. Like the television or the radio or the vehicle, whatever industrial revolution that we've had, people always assume it's this great magic wonder. But the truth is that AI is only as good as you make it to be. So if you program something into context, let's say let's say we're in a Western world and there's a lot of middle class white folks or Caucasian folks, and you program the AI to learn about the people around it, then it's going to only understand, what identifies somebody that's Caucasian. It's not being racist. It's just it doesn't have any other data to be able to input. Say if it was African American or what have you, then that's a limitation. Or if you only put in the calculations that it knows, say if you have somebody that's not good at math and great algebraic calculations, then it's only going to go so far. To your point, where the earthquake is an issue, but it can't predict that because it wasn't programmed to learn. Or if it is programmed and it has machine learning capability, it learns from other people around it. So if you put Trump in its corner, for example, whether you like him or not, he's not perfect. And he always looked to people like Trump who he wants to be like and emulate, not on purpose, but it's almost like a child who's 4 or 5 years old. That child is almost going to emulate the parent mentality and look to them for resources and understanding. Even if you program them, it still needs to learn from somebody else. So the scary part is if you put it with the wrong people, then those mistakes will happen, unintentionally or not. That's a little deep, but that'll give you some food for thought.
Yeah. I watched so there was a Twilight Show marathon over the weekend, and the Twilight Show was from the 1960s, and nice. Really that first kind of analysis of the unspoken questions of life and existence and the dimensions. But there was an episode, and the title is "To Serve Man," one of the most popular episodes of the Twilight series. And in a summary, aliens had come to Earth and made contact, and the aliens looked, somewhat like humans. I mean, so you could, and they communicated through some telepathic means, but basically they had established this program where they were going to have an exchange of so many from their, race or species with ours. And they left a book, and anyway, the government was trying to decipher what this book meant, and they got the title, which was "To Serve Man." And it wasn't until the end of the episode that they realized it was a cookbook. So really what was just happening was, this harvesting of people to be consumed. But the part of this, I think that was so alarming was initially when the first spacecraft comes in, people are all nervous and terrified. Sure. What is this? And this is the most significant moment in mankind. And then, the aliens come in and befriend the humans and say, they do some demonstrations of here's how we're going to fortify your soil and just, life is going to be so much better. And soon that trust is completely given into the aliens, and people are they can't wait to get on these ships and visit this other planet where they have all of these wonderful things available to them, basically Eden. And once you achieve that too, that's the other part. Once you achieve Eden, you don't question anymore, because it's like, well, this is how can it get better than this? And I think, to me, that was really an alarming part of that. There were always messages within the Twilight Zone videos, I think, to get people to be introspective but it's like, if you think things are really good and you're really well taken care of, and maybe the analysis comes in when Edward Snowden talked about the NSA and saying, we have this blind faith in the NSA that they are protecting America from future 9/11 attacks and so many different fronts. And because we have that, we largely just accept it and just say it's out there and it's doing what it needs to do, and that's fine. Without really digging any deeper into that. So, I mean, what are your thoughts there?
Well, you get the conspiracy theorists, say like Snowden, or you get WikiLeaks coming through, or you get, I guess it's I guess there's a YouTube channel called the Young Turks. I don't know if you know them. They're always kind of advocating for the truth, so to speak. And everybody has their own sets of truths. So that to me is kind of interesting, because there's the people that kind of just sheepishly follow whatever the status quo is or whatever they're told. Like you say, they just kind of go along and do their business, almost like, was it Jim Carrey in the movie? He went through, he said, good morning, good evening, good night. Yes. That was the movie. He went around, and I guess that's kind of the perfect example that he was in this movie. He was a real person. He was in a real state, but it was actually the director that gave birth to him or adopted him. And the people around him were all fake actors. They're real people, but they were actors. So they didn't have this emotional connection like he thought, almost absent. So whether or not you want to talk about that as the government, I guess you could say, kind of being fake and untrusting, they'll say what you want to hear. And that's good for most people, but then there's conspiracy theorists and there's folks against the grain, like the people who up with picket signs and what have you. They're the ones who are trying to change and make things better, but yet they're always kind of outcasted as the people who are like the black sheep, for lack of a better expression. So people are always willing to trust corporations, banks, government agencies without question, because they've learned in history that this is the status quo. This is the norm. And their parents have always said, well, you just kind of live with it. You don't challenge it. You just do what you're told and go from there. So people that challenge things in the status quo, they end up going to jail or be tortured or hanged, depending on what culture. And they're just trying to fight for what's right when everybody else is leading down this path. And who knows where it'll take us. And it could be great, or it might not be. And a lot of times we'll go through, like 2008, the crash and the housing crash. That was, at least in the States, and Canada, I think, is coming close. And that was for people, and whether it be Wall Street or it be government agencies, we trusted these people to lead us to the path of success, but yet everything kind of turned around us. We didn't do anything about it. We don't know enough about it, and it's too difficult to change. So we'll just keep going. And the cycle keeps continuing every 10, 20, 30 years. In the 70s, the oil crash and the economy kind of dips. In the 80s, everything kind of spiked because nobody knew what they were doing. And the 1929, the stock market crash. So you kind of go back in history, as I'm doing, and we're not doing anything different than we were hundreds of years ago. We're just still accepting failure and keep moving on.
So you talked about the Jim Carrey movie. That was the Truman Show.
Oh, thank you.
And yeah, where his entire life was being videotaped and broadcast, and he had no idea that was happening.
Yeah.
So, what you talk about is the scientific term I'm going to apply to it, and I'm just using this term because this is a term I'm incorporating into my book, Lessons on Lower Manhattan, the rescue of 500,000 people in 9 hours from Lower Manhattan on September 11, 2001. But I talk a lot about the concept, the torus, which is a mathematical term, but the torus, for simplicity, if you just think of a donut or an inner tube. So, it's circular, and there's room within the torus to move. So the torus represents similarity. And we hear people, Elijah, you hear it, people say, well, it's the same day. This is the same thing. This is the same whatever. It's like, well, no, first of all, nothing can ever be the same. Nothing is the same by definition. Things consist of different molecules and different arrangements. And right after this show, if we did another show, we could never do the same show because we've been informed differently from what we've talked about now and so forth. But we talk about this torus. People get very used to their torus of, you get up in the morning if you're commuting and you drive to work, and you might ask somebody, the entire week, how was your drive? Well, it was the same every day. Well, the fact is it wasn't, it wasn't the same. You had different people around you that you interacted with. The weather was a little bit different. There might have been some delays. You got to work at different times, so, I mean, all these little things, what you listen to in the radio, you could actually, we could say there's a million things if we wanted to.
Sure.
But people are so conditioned to just say, I want to be within my torus and I'm fine. And on September 11th, 2001, when the Twin Towers were hit, the initial reaction was not, running into stairwells and leaving the building. The initial reaction for about 4 minutes was people thinking, well, there's something definitely abnormal going on. I can see flaming debris out my window, which I've read accounts, of people saying this. But the other part was, well, when we do have safety evacuation drills, typically, we're alerted to them. We gather near the stairwells, and, some floors didn't even do that anymore. They just kind of stayed at their desk. And 4 minutes later, they'd buzz and they'd say, okay, all clear. And people were just waiting for the all clear. Although the building shook, they could see debris. In their mind, they would force that back within that toroidal zone of just saying, this is still within normal. This is still, and not everybody did that, but hundreds of people did. And I think that's really a frightening thing, too, of situational awareness and throughout history, and people losing the ability to, I don't know if it's identify when they're moving out of their toroidal zone. You gave great examples, like 1929 in the stock market and in 2008, and things where there were obvious warning signs leading up to that, especially 2008, and we started to see some very bizarre things happening with lending and with home ownership and stuff like that, and student debt, numbers starting to get absurd. And that's another part, I guess I'd like, your thoughts on, with your expertise in banking. Personally, Elijah, I have friends who are so much in debt, between student loans, mortgage, home loans, and credit card debt. We're talking $150,000, $250,000 in debt. Mm-hmm. And the thing is, and they'll say to me, well, I'm going to take this trip down to the Bahamas or whatever, and it's $4,000. It doesn't matter because I'll put it on this card or spread it across 13 credit cards or however that magic happens. And what's the difference between $250,000 and $260,000 in debt? And I'm not sure, my grandparents, they only bought things when they could afford it. They would save up and they knew the sting of the Great Depression. And actually, I think millennials, from what I've been obtaining, understand 2008 and are very hesitant to make purchases such as, vehicles and cars and things like that for not wanting to be in a situation of financial vulnerability because they've saw it, they lived it. But which is very interesting in a consumer-based society. And when all of a sudden you start to have consumers who aren't purchasing but yeah, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Because I see people just becoming very, and not only people, but governments. I mean, you look at 17 trillion in deficits and stuff like this. It's like, well, what's the difference between 17 and 35 at this point?
Mm-hmm.
And it's easy to me then to just totally kind of go on this frenzy, lose responsibility. The other part, it's like, some of my friends, I would worry at night. I'd stay up and be like, oh my goodness, how am I going to make this work? Or, my daughter's going to college, and they don't, it's not there, but it's not just, I'm not singling them out. I think it's a societal thing. I think as, debt in societies all over. What's your take on that?
It's funny you mentioned the millennials, because I see Depression era coming from the 1920s, coming in that Taurus that you described, all the way back to millennials. There was penny pinchers in the 20s because they didn't have anything. Was it the fare costs a nickel or something like that, and you make $1 a day? My grandfather always told me about that stuff, how you had to work hard to pound the pavement. There's no such thing as credit. And he paid for his house in cash when he was retired at 65. That was success for him. And then you take that generation who worked so hard for everything, and then kind of spoiled the baby boomers, because the war was done and everybody was just being rabbits, if you will, for lack of better expression, and making money and having a good time. And then the baby boomers took advantage of that, and their kids kind of get a little spoiled. And then it kind of just happened again, where the baby boomers are doing well, and then that snowball effect happens. And then in the 70s, people kind of had that oil crisis, and they go, oh, hold on. Maybe I don't have as much money as I did. And then people, again, came to the 80s. At least in Canada, we had 19% mortgages, probably similar effect in the States, where everything was just astronomical.
Yes.
That was because nobody could afford to live, or else I guess the spouses came into effect, and they started working because they wanted independence, and they didn't want to be this 50s style housewife anymore. You wanted independence, and women are progressing, and that's a good thing. But then there's now two incomes. And then the economy dropped, and nobody makes $37, $40 an hour. Everybody makes minimum wage, because the jobs are split and the competition is more fierce. Men and women are now competing for jobs. Come into 90s and 2000, and now there's just this crazy amount of spending, because credit cards stimulate the economy to get back into going. And now the society is saying, oh yeah, spend more, spend more, spend more. Let's get the economy going. And then it's just become a norm that we use credit cards, and we're in debt. We use overdraft, and we have loans out to our eyeballs. And up north in Canada, middle class is about 160% debt to income on average, which is nuts. So you have 160% of your income is going to debt, and eventually that debt is just going to run out, right? And then you get 0.5% of interest goes up, and then just you have that 2008 effect where you get subprime mortgages. Everybody doesn't aware. I think the reason for that lack of awareness is just people have accepted this is the norm. I have a sense of entitlement. You owe me this. It's my money. That those words have been used, whether it's marketing or government or just people kind of progressing. And now you have the millennials, if I may skip forward. They're all asking for technology and apps, payment apps with debit cards, because they don't want to use credit. They're scared of what people were doing in the past, like you said, in recent history, that people are just being careless and I guess less educated financially. And now this kind of heightened awareness where kids are going to university more, they're getting more educated and financially smarter, because again, I guess the cycle has continued again, where now we have to penny pinch and be careful. People can't afford things as they could 20 years ago. So we've come that Taurus fashion where now kids are smarter about their money and kind of starting over almost like depression 100 some odd years ago. And then maybe it'll cycle all over again. Who knows? Kind of
so once we get to the point where we inject artificial intelligence, automation, robotics into this system, and we're not going to have as many jobs available, and we start talking about things like universal basic income.
Sure.
So just in the last week in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, they passed a minimum wage of $15 an hour. But ironically, in Missouri, in St. Louis, they passed where they will reduce their minimum wage from $10 an hour down to, I believe, $7.70 or $7.10. So it's going the other way.
Right.
But so you start to see these things. I'm looking at this and saying, "Ooh, these are kind of universal basic income." And I'm going to just take a quote here. And we had shared this one before, but Robert Reich was the former labor secretary in the United States under President Bill Clinton from 93 to 97. And a short quote from him, he said, "Mark my words, a universal basic income is coming as artificial intelligence and robots eat away good jobs. A new policy brief from the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, is a unique forum where the governments of 34 democracies with market economies work with each other, as well as with more than 70 non-member economies to promote economic growth, prosperity, and sustainability development." Now, a few things. I looked up the OECD. Both Canada and the United States are members. And I'm like, okay, I hadn't heard about this before. You have 34 countries involved. You work with 70. And I'm like, this seems very much almost like a new world order type concept of me saying we're going to put into place the framework of, a world basic income. And I guess also, have you seen hints of this in banking at all?
I've heard of different theories about getting to a global currency, and China and the U.S. fighting over for the treasury country, if you will, to be able to have the ability to print money. I know the U.S. does that currently, but China is number two and wants the ability to have that control, and all that implications with war and power and greed and all that come with the printing money. I haven't seen too much. I don't get in the global scale of things, but whether or not it's a world order or what have you, it's just, I guess, just more from news. You see people fighting and the recent effects with North Korea getting involved, and then the UN, like you said, kind of like not necessarily with money, but many countries are together and kind of on the same page, if you will. And then there's outliers like China and Russia who don't want anything to do with this because they're probably afraid as well. Their economies aren't that stable comparatively to the United States, and to be able to bring that back, that I think that's the things that are kind of scary, and that'll kind of push the economy to go on a world scale. I see things like the dollar store. If you probably have those
Yes.
few bucks for purchases, that has created a global economy. Or you'll go to, say, Etsy or something like that, or Fiverr, and you'll have $5, you'll get a service. And that's kind of created worse than the 80s where there's minimum wage jobs and separation. Now these sole proprietors are competing on a global scale against economies that are worth about a third of ours. And to be able to compete is dangerous because people aren't being paid as much. They're not as happy. They're overworked. And if you bring that to a global scale to put everybody on a level playing field, I don't know if that would ever be possible without people just kind of butting heads and not getting along, if you will. So I don't see it a lot, but I don't think it would be good if we try to force everybody to that, especially when you see Europe and the BRICS, that
Yes.
sort of craziness where, again, people vote blindly based on what people tell them. They don't do the research. They just said, okay, the government says this is a good thing. Let's vote and we'll get majority. And then they do the research. And then what happens? Everybody wants to do a revote. And the government says, no, you voted on this. This is your fault, sort of thing. Almost like you know how you tell your girls, no, you're not allowed to do this. You drop the ice cream on the floor, for simple version, and this is something that you have to learn from.
It's funny you mentioned that. One of my daughters was saving up, and I placed an Amazon order just recently, and she saved up and gave me the money for the item she wanted off of Amazon, but then had behavior that did not warrant receiving that item. So when it arrives, it will go into, holding until she kind of earns her right to get that back. So Elijah, I struggle with universal basic income from the standpoint of, let's say we did get to this point through AI, robotics, automation, and so forth, that really, you could work 20 hours a week. And maybe you can tell us what you're aware of with Sweden. I think they've done something where they've decreased their work week and their school week and things like that.
For sure.
Now, my perception on that in America is that people gain sense of purpose and agency so much from their jobs of what they're doing, that if you eliminate those or reduce those, I don't think people are going to be able to fill in that void of how do I gain my sense of agency and purpose. And maybe, it comes through, religion or other things, but I guess I'm not seeing that because I'm not seeing this growth in civic organizations. If anything, my studies indicate that civic organizations such as the JCs, Lions Club, Elks, fraternal organizations, whatever, are declining because people don't have the time to, or we'll say they don't have the time or the interest because, to participate in those things. So I'm looking at this saying, I'm very familiar, with news articles that come out saying this corporate giant is laying off, 3,000 computer engineers. And of that, the backstory is 15 have completed suicide the next day because they said, if I'm not an engineer anymore for this company, I'm nothing. This was everything I did, everything I had. It was there 20 years. And this, what I call it, a laminating effect. And it happens much more than is ever reported upon. And people going into deep depression because they lose a job or a title when actually they haven't lost the skills. They've lost that payment, that goes with that. And maybe what they're perceiving as this, this badge of working. And it doesn't have to be a position like with an IBM or something like that, but any position that they might end up losing. And to me, that's really scary because I don't see where we've evolved enough as a society, in first world societies necessarily to benefit from this. And maybe, but I'm saying that from a United States perspective. What have you seen as far as like Sweden and any adjustments you perceive they've made?
As a parent, 3 kids, I've always liked the idea of being able to work less. I'm sure you have with 2 kids, to be able to spend more time with family. A lot of times we go to work for 8-10 hours a day, work 40-60 hours a week. And over in Sweden, I just kind of poking around and found out that they testing out 6-hour work weeks. Wow. 6-hour work day, pardon me. So 6 hours a day, 30 hours a week instead of 40 to 60, which is phenomenal. People say, well, this can't be done. It's expensive. But I guess when you look at the numbers, they've actually found out that people aren't productive through full 8 hours. Like you and I probably go to the washroom 300 times if you're bored at work or you're not feeling it, or you've written so many business letters and proposals today or sales pitches that you just can't handle it, sort of thing, or your mind just kind of gives up after a while.
Right.
And that's kind of one of the reasons why that people weren't efficient past that 5 or 6 hour mark. So they said, you know what, why don't we just squish it down to 6 hours and see what happens? Another benefit of this, you don't have to pay workers that much longer. You don't have to have them sitting in seats. You don't have to have the computers on. The electric costs are dwindling because it's just, there's no power going, right? So they don't have to pay for that. It's almost like a big conglomerate like Walmart says they're being energy efficient in the summertime to keep cool, but really to be able to take that green movement, it costs thousands of dollars less to switch off, tens of rows of lights.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of cost benefits for that. And then they took the corporate side and said, okay, in the schools, let's take a different approach and we'll do a different style of learning where it'll be only a reduced hour work week, but they became more efficient. The students, instead of writing pen and paper all day, what they did was just take learning-based, activity-based learning rather. So they go outside and learn about nature or how the sun interacts with the grass or what have you, and then take that on and then learn that way while they're doing, so they can kind of absorb a little better than just kind of staring at a teacher and saying, okay, great, I've learned algebra, now what? So there's, I guess, different perspectives in how we can do things differently, and whether or not it's more expensive or not, it's hard to say. We're obviously paying full-time wages for 30-hour work weeks. That's expensive for employers, but if you can offset the costs with the savings of the, running the power or having the people there or paying for cafeteria workers to be there all day, it may very well even out. So that was interesting to see, and maybe some hope for us in North America. But again, I don't know if we're ready for that.
Yeah. And I don't know what happens to people that have much wealth and want to preserve that generational wealth once a UBI comes into place. I've already heard rumors that in the United States, for example, the federal inheritance tax, might be gone, and that's already at, I think, $5.4 million per person. So, I mean, a high number, but it is going to also create all of these efforts among, quote unquote, the financial elite to protect what money is there, because the reality is it's going to be harder to maintain that going forward. Right. At least that would be kind of my perception.
With AI, a lot of people are worried about the base jobs, the labor-intensive jobs, say the UPS drivers or the pizza delivery at, say, Domino's or Pizza Hut, what have you. Or you take the factory workers, and they're all gone. So basically, I would say AI is predicted to take away all the mind-numbing jobs, if you will, all the jobs that are very repetitive. Say if you work for Dodge or Chrysler or GM or even Toyota, all those jobs are fairly repetitive. Right. And if robots can take those away from us, a lot of people say, well, there's a lot of jobs gone. What are we going to do with the economy? But that gives humans an ability to be more interested and more appreciative of the work they do. So perhaps if we can take away the let's call them mind-numbing jobs for fun, the labor-intensive stuff that people don't want to do, or the cab drivers that get, just oodles of, I don't know, it's just the stories you hear is just
right.
Nuts. They get treated poorly. So if you take that all away, wipe that out, and then humans can come to the next step and have some purpose in their life. And then maybe they'll be more productive. Maybe they'll have a chance to be more educated, and maybe they'll have a chance to feel more purpose and lessen those chances of suicide.
So it's really a renaissance, phase is what we're talking about. And are we ready for that?
Right. It's kind of like the Industrial Revolution. Now this is the technological revolution, and it's coming. People are always in fear, like they were back in the 18th, 19th century. Will we be ready for it? Well, hopefully it'll be slow enough where we're going to progress, where we have autonomous vehicles, like in the state of Michigan is piloting that, and there's a few states in Canada that are also taking that on. So, and of course, Elon Musk is making tunnels and whatever else he's doing. So it is coming, but it's just a matter of how, I guess, society works together to be able to put this in place. We'll see how it goes. For me, I don't know if it'll be good or not. Obviously, different people will think of different ideas, but I think it could be, in the near term, it'll be a struggle because everybody will have to make this huge shift in their ideologies, their way of thinking, right? Their daily lives, to say, okay, this purpose that I've had to come to work every day, put my hard hat on, I don't have to do that anymore. Now I have to go learn how to do something else to be more challenging and more difficult. Am I ready for that? But then on the flip side, I'll have more purpose and more interest in life, and then maybe I'll want to work harder. Who knows?
And I think there's much benefit to third world countries, with the introduction of this type of technology and these type of resources that are very cost effective. Even things just as basic as clean, water. Sure. And I was reading an article about tattoos now that can change color to indicate your insulin levels. Oh, so, imagine in a rural application, somebody has type 1 diabetes or something like that, or third world application, and you could actually have this serve as this, pseudo medical tool, to give an alert and things like that. So
That's neat.
it's really fascinating.
I guess if you're talking about third world countries, if I may, David, there was an interesting point I heard about cryptocurrency.
Yes.
That's kind of Bitcoin, if you're familiar, and others. So this is unregulated electronic currency for those who don't know. And in Africa and third world countries, I've heard that a lot of folks that are poor don't have access to banks. So what a lot of mothers will do is they'll have one cell phone in the city, and they'll all be able to use the cell phone and share it to be able to transfer funds back and forth to receive payments for their goods. So if they're making silks or clothing or say clay pots or what have you, they'll be able to sell that goods to somebody else and receive the money for it. It's kind of neat.
Oh, that's amazing.
Even though we say we can't hold on to the paper and understand it, people are still be able to have some sort of means to be able to not barter or trade goods, but to be able to have electronic means to pay for something, almost like a wire transfer electronically. So that's pretty cool too.
Yeah. Oh my goodness, I wasn't even aware that happened.
And here we're worried about minimum wage and what it'll be, and people are now over there are just starting to become into self-sufficiency and income. So it's a big spread.
And so what do you think? What do you think might happen with once we get to this point where we might have a law enforcement that is AI, robotic? That's maybe 100 years down, or maybe not, but do you see that we're going to cross, and I don't know if there's a historical precedence for this, which has been non-human, but are we going to cross into a transference of control of our lives? We've already talked about it here with the self-driving vehicles in Michigan and so forth. And granted, that's largely mechanical and programmed and geographical, but it also, it's a first step. But what if it's a step of if it is a automated, a drone or something, and someone pulls out a gun and fires on someone else, and this drone has programming in it to return fire or to immediately recognize that this is a weapon, and now I guess as I say that, I'm kind of maybe answering my own question that technology would probably advance to the point where you could have non-lethal means to counter that. But
sure.
But I'm wondering, I guess I go back to Terminator 2 a little bit, and are we, this fear certainly exists out there, with technology and artificial intelligence, robotics, and so forth, that we're going to surrender. I guess discretion is probably the best way to describe that. We exercise discretion in what we do. That discretion is going to now be in the hands of a non-human entity.
There has been a lot of talks. If the nerdier you get, the more you understand and kind of research that this could very well be a new race, which is kind of interesting. And then stepping back a bit, you have the HAL 9000 and the Space Odyssey 2001. That being didn't have discretion. He wanted to leave, or the computer HAL wanted to leave one of the astronauts outside because he'd done something wrong. He wasn't perfect, and he didn't want people to know that he killed his other astronaut mate. So he kept him outside to push him away. That discretion is gone because he now developed emotion. But there's been a talk on different documentaries, whether it be Discovery or Curiosity Minds or even, say, YouTube, of singularity. And that singularity purpose is we're playing with DNA technology, so the human life form in technology, and then we have AI and robotics on the other side. And perhaps in 2 decades or 3 decades, they'll cross, and then it'll become DNA with technology, and we'll have the superhuman race, or be able to create whatever we want. People use the term play God, if you will, to create this superhuman being. And the more people want to progress and more people want their names in the history books, the more challenging that it'll be for people to kind of take a step back and say, hold on, are we going too far? Is this really what we want to do? Because there will be a point at some point where we take the singularity and modify DNA in such a way that it'll be too late. And then when it's too late, we can't retract our work. So when somebody wants to make a huge leap in AI technology, you almost have to take 2 steps back and say, okay, is this a progression we want? Because if we go 2 steps forward and we catapult 2 more steps forward, and then we really don't understand what we're creating. And so if we're getting human learning and emotion and learning elements from other human beings, it's just kind of a big snowball effect. And if that person or if that being teaches other people to be or other AI beings, it's hard to define what this will be, but it's almost like if there's a whole bunch of them together, they can work together and then turn, if you will, on human race. And that's what a lot of people worried about. On the other side, I've heard a lot of talks about how it'll bring people together, to force people to come together and not make hasty decisions. So hopefully the positive side of the human race will come together and actually work towards this, and then if we're going to evolve this into a race, then at least it'll be something to help humans get along. Unlike, say, way back when dinosaurs ruled the world, that was extinct, right? So there was no progression beyond that.
Right.
It just kind of died off, and whatever happened, they're gone. So hopefully we can evolve and work cohesively, and at the same time, maybe we'll be able to keep some sort of track that maybe they'll live for thousands of years, and then be able to take our history books and our purpose and our hope and kind of drive that forward to wherever universe that looks like. So that's kind of my dream, I guess you could say.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember, my grandparents, and, when they passed away, and, were in their 70s and 80s, and now, listening to, with possible genetic, modification, plus, reproduction of parts, human organs and so forth in labs, plus, cyber replacements of eyes, or, we've started to see some things, cochlear implants.
And things like that, sure.
Yeah. Are we looking at a lifespan which, could range out into hundreds of years, or unless something catastrophic happened, almost indefinitely? And I read an article, Elijah, where there's a company will start experimenting with deceased individuals on trying to bring them back to life. And it's like a 15-day process of how they would do this.
So we're not talking about cryogenics or freezing people. This is their ticker's gone. They flatlined.
Yeah. And
Okay.
the part is, the ethical questions, too, of what if you can bring them back to a state where they would have what we would represent today as like a severe cognitive disability. And that's how far you can get them back. Well, then, who pays for their care? Is this something this person would have wanted, that they are severely impaired? So yeah, really scary stuff, but it will commence. I mean, the people have signed on to participate, in these experiments. And then I think, when we talk about agency and purpose, 200 years ago was pretty straightforward.
Sure.
Have a family, clear some land, that you got to see start to finish with your crops or whatever. And but now, I mean, if you're stretching agency and purpose over 300 years, if I'm like, telling someone, I mean, of course, there'd be different things you do, but I mean, how do you, I guess, I think it's going to be really hard to educate people on how to sustain agency and purpose over that amount of time, especially when I think religion is going to really be questioned when, we can, I mean, because a lot of people subscribe to religion, because you never knew what was happening in the afterlife. Hamlet, to be or not to be, it was, well, if I kill myself, I could go to this paradise, which would be awesome. But if there isn't this paradise out there, I could end up just with this eternal sleep. So the to be or not to be, where do I go with this? Sure. And I think it could have with religion. I guess I find it hard to see how religion would be sustained, because the fear of death would really be gone. I mean, right. And that's a big part of religion is, this is my life here, and religion is my passageway into, as you indicated with Qin, or Quin, and the dynasty. I mean, he was terrified of what was happening afterwards, so that's why he put this army together to protect him through that. But we're not going to really need to do that if you know that if something happens to you, or periodically, maybe there's this monitor and it is always making a digital, off-sited replica of all of your brain patterning and waves, where you could, if something did happen to you, you got a tree fell on you and you're killed, there could be a replica of you that is made and still has your thoughts and whatever to a certain point within an hour.
It's a Black Mirror on Netflix is what you described.
Okay.
I don't know if you've seen that, but the show takes the truth and stretches it just far enough where you almost think this is possible. And to be able to come up with ideas and using technology and social media, and then taking that into a literal sense, like blocking somebody on Facebook or Twitter, you actually see the person grayed out, and that person can't see you, sort of thing, to take that really literal sense of everything, which is kind of neat. But I guess taking things further to have purpose, science may take over to the point where religion is not necessarily that it's not accepted, but I guess science would take over, would take one step further. So you could take that person back 15 days later. They could be in a vegetable state, but then we'll swap out their brain or whatever organ, or put a chip in them, and poof, now they have ability to walk, talk, think, and off they go.
Right.
In hundreds of years, we're already doing this with chips and weird things and wireless technology. So who knows? It could be quite possible. The afterlife won't exist. We'll always just be here on the planet forever and ever and ever, to go through all these trials and tribulations and cycles, almost like a vampire, I guess, to go through and live eternity. And then would we realize that this is so great after all? Would you just want to live 1,000 years and say, hey, science did this, I'm living again, sort of thing. I'm 1,000 years old and people call me Noah, and here we are. Do you think that would be so great, though? Would you think that it'd be so good to have science just want us to live forever? Or would people accept that? And they just said, you know what? I'm going to stick with religion. I'm going to stick with what I know, and maybe less science, and we'll just be happy.
I think society would have a pushback against that and say, I want to live for 100 or 150 years, and then that's it. I don't want any measures to extend my life beyond that. I don't want a perpetual life. I mean, my parents have told me that. I mean, technology doesn't exist, but they've said if it did exist, I don't want to live 1,000 years. I believe you're only, and the fact it's biology for every other living organism on Earth. Sure. I mean, we're not going to make every turtle live indefinitely and so forth. But for me, I would not opt for perpetual existence.
It's weird.
I don't know. And yet, we've talked about, or at least maybe I've put this in more of a darker shade of AI and robotics and things. But the reality is, like, we could have a very clean environment. We could have, food that we know would be safe to eat. It could be, almost this Eden type thing, because, we're not going to have, gasoline powered vehicles. We're not going to have coal plants and other things. We're going to evolve beyond, these types of things right now, which are degrading the environment. And in turn, we know that our environmental state is closely tied to purpose and agency and sense of self and things like that. But yeah, I've tossed that around my mind a little bit, and I don't think I'd want a perpetual existence. And in reality, I mean, we're not going to have a perpetual existence unless we find another planet at some point, because
Sure.
our
There's a
sun, but
clock. Yeah. Or else you take into minimum wage and different classes. If somebody wants to pay $10,000, they'll be able to flip the switch and say, okay, you can have perpetual life. Or somebody else that's poor and say they're not able to afford, then they'll turn off their switch earlier, perhaps. Dark, sorry. But,
yeah, no, I agree.
If you're going into that world, then anything's possible. If you're talking about, say, if somebody wants to have brown or blonde hair, they can do that with DNA manipulation, but you can also kind of take that too far. I think that's really the kind of the point that I get back on, David, is just if it goes too far, we're in trouble. And if we go too far, it may be a whole nother revolution where we'll just kind of go back to 300 years ago, stick to our farms and just have a nice family and just live a simple life again. Never know, that might go too far, and then we'll just kind of society reject it altogether, come back and then full circle 300 years ago. Stick to farming and plows.
I didn't grow up on a farm, so I'm in trouble, Elijah.
Yeah, well, me too. I have longer arms so I can reach the trees for the apples,
right,
and the rest I'll have to figure out.
Are you familiar with deaf culture at all?
No.
Okay. So I work with the Wisconsin School for the Blind, and our partner school is the Wisconsin School for the Deaf. And there is such a thing as deaf culture, meaning if the parents are deaf and they have a child who's deaf, the parents typically do not want that child to have a cochlear implant, or if they were given the opportunity to suddenly have hearing, they would say no. That takes you out of our culture, and it's very strong. I teach a few college classes in inclusion of students with disabilities, and some people will pick this as a course, a final course project is to examine deaf culture. But yeah, it is something. And I said, at some point, disability will become, obsolete. Disability will be, or the potential to make it obsolete. You'll be able to modify that through, DNA engineering or if it's some kind of, cerebral palsy, there would be some kind of device which would then, monitor the electrical signals going to the muscles and so forth. So I said, we're on a course, and, so definitely, of course, I see that as being good. I work with, students who are young people who are blind and tremendous people, but I don't think any of the students I work with, if I said, you have the option to be blind or to be sighted, which would you take? They would take sighted. They would not, but the deaf culture is different. The deaf culture definitely stays within the culture, which I guess it's throwing it out there. It's a phenomena if anyone wants to look into it a little bit more. But there's this shunning that occurs. Yeah. If your child has received a cochlear implant, where you could lose your friends who are deaf, because, you've taken that step.
Sounds like it's old order Amish, obviously completely different from deaf culture, but it reminds me of that sort of we'll call segregated community.
Yeah.
Often, if you tried, there's been, I don't know how true the reality TV show is on TLC or what have you, but there's actually getting out of that Amish culture that I'm getting out of this religion and way of life. You go to the normal society, if you will, and you're shunned. You can't get back in. So I guess a lot of people still hold on to the beliefs that they have, and then society doesn't accept them as willingly. And maybe that just pride takes over and says, you know what, we have to hang on to this because future generations won't understand how impactful perhaps this life actually is on society. It's quite possible.
Yeah, and perception is in the eye of the beholder, and this, inter-rater reliability of what people see as society and being correct in society and so forth. I mean, that is so varied. I want to touch on something that we talked about earlier. So let's say you did have a perpetual lifespan, and you get up in the morning. So Elijah, what do you think would be the motivation when, today is not going to be much different than 584 days from now, like that toroidal zone that I talked about.
Right.
And even things like, right now we deal with hurricanes and things like that, which are bad, but also introduce noise into our lives and cause us to change, and often, bring forward changes in character and things like that. And those things, I mean, I would have to assume would largely be controlled, with technology down the road too. But so if I get up and, I go through my day and I go to bed and it's Groundhog's Day. That's what with Bill Murray, it is getting up and it's the same thing. And I guess I would expect that's what would largely be there. You'd be in this toroidal zone. There wouldn't be a lot of surprises, because even like if there's an asteroid that is, heading toward Earth, well, the technology would have detected that way ahead of time and would have remedied that. So again, your threats to self and your need for sense making and situational awareness probably pretty low. I mean, you can have a more leisurely lifestyle, more enjoying, but I guess, is there a fatigue in that? Is there this again? And
it's really strange, because I don't think there'd be that sense of urgency. Like, people want to climb the corporate ladder or to be able to do everything, fulfill their bucket list, if you will, in the short 80-year span that most people have. But if you live a perpetual life, what's the hurry? Where's the sense of urgency? Where is the success rate? How am I going to measure this when I don't know when the end of time is? So if I'm looking to, say, have children or grandkids, or like 13 generations of grandkids, I think there would lead to a whole lot of other sense of depression and kind of lack of purpose, because your whole reality shifts, and you are the Groundhog Day and Bill Murray, and you just go through life. And then I think he just swears at the weather, and then he just kind of ruins people's day and just turns into a prankster, because his sense of pride and happiness and just purpose is shot out the window. We think that this sense of perfection and longevity is incredible, but if you're doing it over and over again, I mean, you could see the world 25 times over. It's not exciting anymore. And to take in every breath of air that we take in, because we appreciate life, it's short. There is that urgency and pride, but if there's nothing to live for, you're just going to live on forever, in a kind of dark sense. But yeah, I'm just here. I'm existing. Now what?
I talked to somebody who, really got into hiking in their 30s and went and hiked, like all around the world and things, and just it was fulfilling and these new things. But then said, once I went and did all of this, once I got to the second, third time around, it really lost its. I wasn't fulfilled by it, and now to the point where I don't even like to do it as much anymore. Like, I'll do it, but so getting into other things. But one of those things too of once you've done it, I mean, there's so many times you can climb Mount Everest. And even for myself and for you, I mean, one of the things I like to do is I love biking. So,
sure,
I'll go out and I'll bike like 80 miles and I'll, plot out the trek. And, the first 5 to 8 bike rides of the season are pretty exciting. But after that, my mind starts to wander a little bit. And on the way back on the treks, even though I love biking, it's things, I've seen trees, I've seen stuff. And even if you go every place, I mean, it's still kind of the same to some extent. And it's like, I know this is great for me and I do like it. And I like my body feeling strong and stuff, but still, like, yeah, like I've done this, and even though this is my passion, like, and the scenery, is changing a little bit, but I've done it, and
On the way back, then you'll just call your friend up and say, "Come pick me up," and just go for a car ride instead, or you'll get your car autonomous vehicle to come pick you up, or it'll follow you along. Who knows? It's not the same. What's the point? I'll just do some other mode of transportation, or maybe you won't go out at all, because you have the 80 miles and that's a piece of cake. Now you go so far, and then you don't want to come back because it's just boring, or you're tired, or you just feel like doing something else. So it's kind of interesting to think about.
when we were at Disney in March, they have wristbands which can GPS identify where you're at now. And they've always had some level of this, but apparently this was new, they were telling us. So the wristbands allowed you to get into your door, charge, all of your, so basically it's cashless. The whole time we're down there, I didn't even have my identity on me in the park. And you get off of rides or whatever, and it would say, "Thank you, David, for, and the other names for being on this ride." And the thought of if you had a lost child and you were within the park, they could identify where you were at in the park and reunite you. And somebody asked me, they said, "Did that really freak you out?" And I was like, no, I never thought about it in that way. I thought about it as a positive evolution of technology of now I don't have to carry a wallet with me. I can get into my room this way. If there's anything that happens to me medically, then someone knows who I am. If one of my kids gets,
allergy or something.
Yeah, off in an area and I don't know where they're at, and they go to a Disney worker, the Disney worker can scan, their thing. And then they would take pictures of us. They have photographers all over. They take your picture, and then you go up and they swipe your band, and instantly it goes into your email. And the photo that they just took is emailed to you. And just the amazing. So yeah, looking at that, I'm like, that's all awesome. Like, those are all awesome things that technology has brought forward to that experience and has made that experience better for me to be able to enjoy without, worrying about the kids, worrying about, having, a wallet on me, and going through Splash Mountain and hoping my dollar bill doesn't get saturated or whatever it is. But I know we've been talking for a while, and one thing I wanted to get your thought on is, what do you think is going to motivate people in the future? And as you say that, I'm going to go back to something I learned in a recent podcast that I developed about World War II infantry motivation.
It's a motivation to become more accessible. I guess it's kind of, again, it's something we need to get used to, because it's not the norm. You have to get used to a reduction of privacy to have the luxury of efficiency, like yourself with the band. It knows you. It knows exactly where you are in the park. It knows how long you've had to wait. It knows where you go for lunch. It knows all the different pieces of data points to make the park more better. But not everybody's ready to have Big Brother watching to be able to create these efficiencies, and they want some sort of privacy. There's different futuristic cities that kind of dreamed about, and the people have kind of created to be able to put different sensors in the streets and different cameras all over the place to be able to monitor people to make them feel safe, but at what cost, right? So that's kind of tricky. I think we'd have to get over that sense of freedom to be able to get used to not having that same freedom in exchange for privacy or the luxury of efficiencies before we can even introduce making that change. I'm not too sure what that trigger or benefit will be, or if it's by force from governments to get, say, commoners like us to be able to adjust, but that's the crucial piece. So I don't even know if I could think that far to be able to explain what it'll be like without us being willing to go through that motion of change. We're used to Facebook and Twitter taking all of our data, and the free apps that we have that are taking our data and doing something with it. Probably even Skype now records stuff, or consoles, video game consoles will record things and just listen for that cue, almost like Apple and Siri or something like that, or Amazon Echo. All of that data is going somewhere and being saved. will we be ready to lose all of our freedom in exchange for that pleasure, I guess you could say? Do you think so? Maybe I took that where else in a different direction you were thinking. Might kind of wonder why I'm talking about privacy. It kind of wanders off and kind of think of what ifs. So it just curious to think what society, how they'll react before we kind of get there.
I have a neighbor who is one of 2 commercial drone pilots in our county.
Okay.
And so he uses his drone for professional purposes of checking, wind turbines, and actually has the ability with his drone to fly over a gravel pit, and can fly over in the morning, and has scanners then to identify how much gravel is there, can fly over it at the end of the day and then tell you how much gravel's been removed. So you don't even have to weigh the vehicles anymore. It is just done through this process. But he's talking to me and he said, yeah, I've done flyovers of our neighborhood, and I could just plug this in and print off a 3D map and all of this stuff. And I can zoom in and I could read a piece of paper that or the newspaper if you're out on your backyard. And I trust him, but he's going over this and talking about the laws and because I said, isn't there a law that you can only fly over like once? He said, well, no, like you could do this and this and this. And he said, actually, like if I wanted to, the amount of detail I could find out about anybody would be just, astounding. Through this drone capacity. Now, we flip it around, and he was talking about a friend that had a drone and was called into a rescue of a missing boy with autism, young child. And so I interviewed a search and rescue dog handler, and she talked about this very intricate process of having to get 2-way radios together and how, you coordinate with your teams and zones, and the dogs fatigue actually pretty rapidly. And he comes out with this drone, and in an hour they find the kid because he's up and he can detect heat zones and all of that. And the kid's fine, and he does this. Good. But it's scary. He's talking to me then and giving me kind of all of the other things that this drone is capable of doing. And especially, I'm thinking with personal privacy, if you had somebody, we read about these cases all the time of stalkers or things like that. Well, you get your hands on a drone now, personal privacy is pretty much out the window. You can fly up above somebody's apartment or their house and know when they're coming in, who they're coming in with, snapshots. So that part is it's a natural evolution, but in the hands of somebody, and you can buy, you can buy these things at Costco. In the hands of somebody who wants to use it in that capacity, it opens up a whole realm of invasiveness that you could have only gotten by overtly breaking the law. While here you're fringing the law, and there's, like you said, there's a lot of things you can do which technically you're not breaking the law. Like you can have a park that says you can't fly a drone here, but what the law means is you can't fly a drone in the park. You can stand a foot outside the park, raise your drone up and fly it wherever you want over the park. That the FAA doesn't allow municipalities to put this regulation on that overlays and the FAA regulation that would say that this is priority over FAA. So, but yeah, so that kind of freaks me out. And I guess we're talking about motivators, and back in World War II. So the average day and again, war is going to completely change because war is going to become either just non-existent or it's going to be probably drone based or whatever. I mean, our reality today of ICBMs, well, you'd have technology that would be able to make sure that a launch never even occurred. But back in the Fifth Army, which was Sicily, North Africa, very overfought army. And the infantrymen, if you lasted 238 aggregate days of combat, like that was the tops. You were either physical casualty, prisoner of war, or psychiatric casualty. And actually, during World War II and before, if you cracked under pressure, and I'm just saying this as the vernacular that was used, the shell shock, battle fatigue, like that was seen as a weakness in you, and you were like, discharged out of the military, and that's a fault with you. And today, where it's changed, I mean, now it's looked at, it used to be looked at as PTSD, that actually has evolved to PTSI, post-traumatic stress injury, of just, and really brain-based, it makes sense of saying the brain can only handle so much cumulative stress before it can't process that stress anymore.
It shuts down, yeah.
But in World War II, so they took the Fifth Army, and morale has declined, and your chance of survival, and they're trying to figure out, well, what will these soldiers, what can motivate them? So they had a few approaches. One is they did videos, why we fight. You can go on YouTube, and Frank Capra, famous Hollywood producer, worked with Dr. Seuss, and we all know Dr. Seuss and the Cat in the Hat. Oh, yeah. Dr. Seuss also had a very dark side with propaganda, anti-American Japanese, and also basically propaganda of you need to do your part and you can't be weak. And again, if you were battle fatigue was seen as a weakness and that you'd failed the country, and this was all being exposed. I mean, But what was going to be the difference maker? So one was, we just need to show videos of like why you need to fight, how horrible Germany and Japan and Italy are, and that you need to rise to the occasion. And if you don't do this, your families are all going to be, pillaged by these foreign countries and so forth, and everything that you've worked for, your dreams and everything will be gone. So propaganda. That didn't work. People, it's like watching a Rocky movie or some Independence Day or whatever movie. You're fired up at 2 hours after you get out of the theater, you can do anything, and then after that reality sets in. But what they found, then they're like, well, we can double the pay and we can increase the pay of frontline infantrymen. And they were like, no, it doesn't, we're not going to do it. But then they said, we're going to give you a blue patch, a blue shoulder patch. So maybe cost $0.25. And it's only for you, for frontline infantry. And this is a badge of honor. It's a badge of pride because you're fighting on the front line. And that made all the difference, that badge. And people in other divisions in like artillery would say, well, we want our badge. And they say, military's like, nope, this is only for infantry. And what would happen? Some artillery soldiers would transfer from what was a safer self-preservation into frontline military for that 25-cent patch. So this whole psychology, too, of what motivates people and what doesn't, completely irrational. And even, when I talked about and I'm writing my book about the 9/11 boat rescue, 500,000 people. My friend, I talked about that travels the world, and she's in her 20s, and she's been to Haiti like 14 times. She said in Haiti, when she delivers humanitarian aid, like bags of rice, people are ready to punch her. They are fighting each other to get up to wherever this distribution of resources is. And yet on 9/11, we had a very orderly rescue of 500,000 people. We didn't have anyone, after the second tower goes, after Tower 7 goes. And it's this, and I remind people, I'm like, it was very dynamic. People didn't know if the mine was if the harbor was mined, and we had, what was it? Boats in Yemen, which would be, loaded up with explosives and then like just driven into, Navy ships and so forth. If the bridges, had explosives. So this was still very dynamic. And was there another plane out there that just hadn't come in yet? Were there timed explosives? But it was very, very orderly of how this rescue happened. And I get into a theory on that, which no one else has gotten into. And I get into the theory of transference. And it's really only specific maybe to that point in time to some extent. But transference of saying, let's look at the demography of who was evacuated. And the average person, a typical, I guess, that made up the majority, they worked in Lower Manhattan in the financial district. So that was your majority. So, 40 years old, educated, so you have an IQ above average. But you also then, there's another part in this, and this is where I think everybody missed this. And I worked with a number of experts around the world, and some agree with me and some don't, but this is my book. I say transference occurred. These people were born in, let's say, 1960, 61. They grew up during the Cold War. And in the United States during the Cold War, we saw CNN in 1980 went 24-hour news. And what were they showing? They were showing Russian parades of ballistic missiles, up and down the roads. And I was raised during this era somewhat too. And you just felt the Soviet Union was the enemy, and you had to be with NATO, and the military was there to protect you. So that was the thing. You always saw the U.S. military. There was no questioning of the military. So when people come to the harbor, there were 134 boats in this rescue. Most were tugs, 50, but there were some Coast Guard. And I think the moment you see that out there, you give transference of saying, I was raised at a time when I was told to believe in the government, that the military would say, be there to rescue us. And do you by chance, Elijah, remember the 1983 ABC documentary, or not documentary, but it was a movie called The Day After?
Parts of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So anyone listening, you can go online and find it through, YouTube. But The Day After, and it was very controversial when it came out, was what it would be like if there was an all-out, nuclear war between the United States and Russia. And it actually, Gorbachev and Reagan both came out later and said the movie led to them signing treaties for military ICBM reduction. I mean, it's very visceral. Very visceral. So yeah. The strangest part is, 9/11, it should have been chaos. It was chaos, but it had this toroidal system that developed, and people weren't pushing over other people, even though the buildings are collapsing in back of them. Right. I think because this transference, because of when they're raised, they're like, okay, but you and I mean, we're rational. If you get a couple people just engage in a discussion for a minute and say, you know what, there's 500,000 people of us. I mean, you can see no one has obviously ever planned for this. We don't know what this is at. And there's boats out there, and they've obviously never coordinated for this. This is illogical that this is going to work. But the fact that people didn't go there, they just said this blind transference, I think is the reason that was successful. Because I believe it should have been chaotic. It should have been a mob. It should have been like evacuate, like from a hurricane or anything else. And really, really strange. No one kind of went there, and I dug into it with some of the world experts. And again, not everyone kind of agrees to that, but this transference of what we're told, and then when situations manifest later in life, that we make those connections. So I don't know. I just thought it was really interesting. The whole book centers and it talks about it, and this fact of how this kind of miniature system developed. And actually it goes against systems thinking too. Russell Aikoff, are you familiar with Dr. Russell Aikoff and systems thinking? Kind of branched off on Deming a lot. He would say that, if you had a machine, let's say you have a Mercedes, if you put in a Hyundai motor, even if it's the best Hyundai motor, the Mercedes won't work because, the parts aren't compatible. They're not designed, which kind of makes sense. But at the same time, as I looked at the rescue, I was saying all of these parts came together: sightseeing boats, people, tugboats, people, different levels of expertise. And it created a system that only had to exist for about 9-10 hours and then dissolve. So I think these short-term systems can exist. Now what that means and what we're thinking and all this, I don't know, in the long term. But I think it was a moment in time. People try to analyze that and compare it to Oklahoma City. And then what if 9/11 something like this happens years from now? Well, I mean, it probably wouldn't, because you'd have the ability to land planes, remotely. It's just like if somebody is leaving a job and they have a ID badge, it gets them in the building, you can stun the badge so it doesn't have effect anymore. I don't know. I kind of went off a little bit on a tangent there. Any thoughts?
I don't know if the transference almost stems from a state of shock or maybe an underappreciation for what's going on. Some people just kind of sit there and panic. You're right. And when they know what's going on, say a fire or an earthquake or a tornado, hurricane, they know what that is. But when you have people that are coming at using planes to take out, giant skyscrapers, we don't know what that is. Never seen that here, at least in North America. So to be able to put that into some sort of, I don't know, explanation, it's almost impossible. And that goes back to, say, the 283 days that you will, or the 250 days in war. It almost comes to the point where in instant, that 283 days is passed. And now in seconds, your mind can't take this because it's too much. And then that it's almost like your mind kind of takes over and you come into the state of protection. I guess it's what your body's doing to say, don't panic. It's going to be okay. You just got to be calm and cool. Almost like a button or switch. It's almost like a adrenaline kicks in, and then all the state of mind comes through and says, you know what, just focus, let's go. Or else people are just kind of in shock and looking for that leadership to be able to say, this is what we need to do. And then all of a sudden, it's almost like in my mind that time pauses for an instant second, and then all of a sudden, poof, somebody gives direction and off we can go and breathe again. That's kind of where I am at the shock. But either way, I don't think it's something that we could prepare for or just explain any day. It's just one of those things where everybody kind of just reacts and comes together, and they're just one thing they have in mind is just to survive, and they're all going to do what they can to come together as decent human beings and then create that survival tactic. And perhaps that's what we'll do with our next generation of AI. That's what we'll do going forward. But that one piece of solidarity versus all this talk of war is kind of frustrating. If we could do more of that to come together and work together and get 500 people to survive, perhaps we're capable of anything. And several hundred years from now won't be so bad.
And I think there's a lot to be learned from the rescue of Lower Manhattan about, as you indicated, solidarity and how people can work together. And if we start to create a transference now of seeing how AI, automation, how it is benefiting us, that then as changes occur down the road that maybe more directly impact us, that we will have, not that we're submitting our faith over into AI, but we will consciously accept that interaction with AI versus pulling back. Because what happens, people become anxious of the unknown. That's always the case. And when working with students who are visually impaired, right off the bat, that's something in working with, helping kids get jobs in the community or something, people say, it's a great kid, but I don't know how to work with a kid who's blind. I'm like, well, it's not that much different than working with whatever. And here's some things. And once you get beyond that, you answer some of those questions. So I think our transference for the generation of today is really how we start to get kids in prepping and young adults prepping for transference into a society, which if they go to a hospital and, in some of their care might be delivered through, a robot that's coming in to take, instead of a nurse is coming in to take pulse and whatever, and maybe it has a face and image and things like that. Or maybe it is, we already see remote a patient lives an hour and a half from the hospital. So the hospital gives them an iPad and says, log in, show us the knee, move it, after your knee surgery so much, tell us what you're doing. The doctor's on the screen. Okay. Looks good. And there we go.
Sure. It's happening. And even apps that have doctors that are available for those who don't have, they're readily available, or maybe the clinic's full, but to be able to have that purpose, or to bring out the dad cheese in me, to get that hope and inspiration. It kind of reminds me of, I guess, John Lennon's Imagine. There's this, even in the 60s, he's talking about the freedoms, and imagine how people can be just cohesive and get together and just get all this, I guess, in this mushy state of just happiness and freedom and just enjoying life in the simple human pleasures. And like you said, if somebody's visually impaired or has Down syndrome, remove that barrier and just say, you know what, you're a person, or David's a person, or Elijah's a person. We're just talking and interacting and trying to coexist to be able to better our generation's lives from here on in.
When I started, Elijah, and I know we're in wrap up mode now. When I started to work with kids who were blind, I hadn't ever worked with a kid who was blind, and I did that later in my career, and it was actually a high school student who taught me Braille, and so I can read Braille, which is much different than being able to do tactile Braille, and I can read very basic Braille, but it's functional, and actually I don't need to use it a lot. But it was one of those things where I asked somebody who had worked at the school, who I trusted, who went into that situation a few years prior, had worked as a math teacher in a high school, traditional high school, and left to go down and to work at this school. It's really an awesome place. First of all, it's really phenomenal. It's a quarter-mile long. The students stay there during the week, so there are residence halls. There's a pool. There's a theater. Gymnasium. I mean, awesome. It's really cool. So there's also this family, aspect of it. But I remember asking him, like, how do you learn this stuff? Like, how do you learn this? Or like if a child's using a cane or whatever. And he's like, you just do. Like the kids will teach you, and it'll be so much of your environment, and you'll just get it, and boom, you get it. And it's shown, for me, it's been a ton of growth because I teach the university level college or courses on inclusion of students with disability. And I can start talking about my experiences with that. But then also in safety, like, I work with keeping the campus safe from active shooter situations and fire drills and things like that. And so I've had to reshift my thinking in, what if you don't have the modality of sight available to you? How do you respond to an active shooter situation as a student? And come up with new protocols for that, which has really helped me professionally, too. And so in closing, and I don't know, I mean, I could go on forever, Elijah. This is a great conversation. I think people are really going to, find this to be, I think, a good conversation to listen in on. And
it's interesting, and it gives a lot of perspective. So I think there's a lot of meat and potatoes, and you're right. I could kind of just switch off to technology side or talk about learning Braille and American Sign Language and then go into part 2. But, there's only so much that people can sit down and listen, right? So that's the tough thing.
So yeah. So I'm going to, I wanted to get your thought on this because I've asked other podcasters, and I love podcasting. I'm new to podcasting. Again, this is something, who would have thought this would have existed? But to me, and I have a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I consider the podcasts that I download, including Nerdy by Nature, and Readily Random, a number of podcasts that inform me on topics that are all over the place, but come together in helping me to think about different aspects of history or science or society. And I've actually told people, well, one is I don't partake in the mainstream media anymore. I've just kind of burned out on it. And that's just me, but I don't. Like, someone could say, did you know that this happened? Whatever. I say, I don't know. Or I've kind of had my fill of sports. I mean, not that I'm anti-sports. I went to every Green Bay Packers game in the 1990s, every home game. But, I couldn't, yeah, and I'll go to some games, but it's not like I live and die. I have like one Packers shirt, and things like that. But actually this office, this studio behind me up until just a few years ago was just all Packer memorabilia and stuff like that. And I was kind of like, nah, I need to change it. That was kind of a different time in life. But I see podcasting also as the societal evolution, and it's happening rapidly. And I see it as a very good thing versus, necessarily Facebook, Instagram, some of those things which are very reactionary. You don't need to put much thought into them and not very deep. But podcasts, you're developing your script. You're getting to work with more intricate technology, focusing in on an audience. And then for the consumers of podcasts to have it available and to download. There's a podcast. I was interested in the Oroville Dam in California, the biggest dam, 700 feet in I don't know if it's the tallest dam in the U.S., I think. And they had issues with the spillway. And there was a guy who took on just basically covering this and putting together little shows. And he has an airplane he'll fly over, and then he'll edit stuff together. And he goes to the town meetings. And I'm like, I just got hooked on this. Like the science I was learning about how water cavitates, and as water goes down, the the drainage spill or whatever, how if the spill isn't totally flat, it has ripples in it, gets air bubbles, and they basically act like a hammering effect. And he's talking about this in ways like I never knew about. And I'm like, wow, this is really cool. So
right.
I see podcasting is opening up this whole other avenue for society, for creativity, for information, for knowledge that is removed from rhetoric and can give people education and almost this, I call it my postdoctorate as I listen in my commute. I mean, do you feel the same or different or partial? Or?
I think it's kind of interesting because you're going back to George Orson Welles in the 1930s with the old radio shows, the old musicals, and they just took this new technology and kind of discovered what they could do with it, which was pretty cool. Now with podcasting, it's kind of come with technology. It's readily available and sourced for people. Like you said, you can just download in seconds, but yet we're taking that conversation, that old school mentality, that's the historical factor, the simple times in life, and just having conversations about what's important to us. For me, I just talked about a recorded episode about Chicago and the history of that, and how in the 1850s, they were the first ones to come up with a sewer system because they were on the sea level. You couldn't go under. It's too flat.
Okay.
So to get rid of all this filth and waste on the streets, you had to lift up the city. And that was 8-9 feet, 4 to 14 feet up in the air. At one point, it was 6,000 of these. I forget the name of them now. Pardon me, but they were the devices that lifted up trains back in the day. So they some sort of ties that you just twist, and there's 6,000 of these in 35,000 square feet, and there was 600 workers, 6,000 of these devices, and it goes up the hotel or a whole city block. I mean, that stuff you never think about. And Chicago now has a sewer system that is taken for granted. And these hundreds and thousands of people came in through the city and realized that all these people have to do this job, that nobody ever think of, to be able to make sure that people exist. And that's kind of the stuff that I get into, all those hidden treasures and nuggets, the stuff that you don't see on a daily basis, like the 24-hour CN News or the Fox News, all that stuff that's kind of mind-numbing. You can get into podcasting, and then you can explore, as I say, to discover the world around us for my podcast, and just kind of get into things that are different and interesting and inspiring. And you can go around and pick whatever you want, whether it's science or accounting or even the safety doc. That's for me really cool. And then you take the social media and have a conversation about it with your friends or fans or whoever, and then everybody's learning, and it creates a spiral effect, which is really, I guess that's kind of the essence right there. It's just how amazing this really is, to be able to take a simple technology, take a bit of a old-fashioned radio feel, blend them together, and now we're coexisting, and now we're getting out of the traditional propaganda of Seuss. We're getting into real conversations and truths, and even stuff we want to talk about. Like I said, whether it be science or retro gaming, or you want to talk about horses, I don't care. It's what people love. Do it. And that's what's so great about it.
Yeah, what you just shared about Chicago, fascinating. I had no idea. Fascinating.
And you're closer to Chicago than I am.
I know. Wow. Anything else, Elijah, that you want to touch on today?
I think we did a good job. Some other point, we'll have to come back and figure out how we're going to find something else that troubles us. But society, I think, was pretty good today. I think that we kind of went from olden days to today, and then back around in a bunch of tourist circles. We did okay, and for people to hear kind of that perspective, I guess, to stretch out timeline of 2,000 years and to really figure out that we're not really that much different. I think that's kind of neat, and I think that's enough for me and powerful enough to leave it at that.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and I think it's an exciting time, to be alive. And I'm very thankful for, what podcasts have brought forward, and especially the fact that we're doing this today.
Sure.
So again, I have my Safety Doc podcast, and I appreciate, that you've had kind words to say about that. I'm still finding my way with that. But I do feel that, that the show has come together much, since the first few episodes, because safety is so
Sure.
diverse. I mean, you can get into physical safety, psychological safety. So I try to dance in all of those, different, barns, and then come back and interview, a number of people who have expertise in different areas. And I love your show, because as you said, you can bring forward something that everybody has overlooked, which if that didn't happen, that one component, what exists today as we know it, like Chicago, wouldn't be there.
Right. It's kind of wild.
So it is wild. It's fascinating. And I just love that. I just love that stuff.
And between the both, I guess, David, whether it be Nerdy by Nature or the Safety Doc, we both kind of take elements of just learning and interesting facts. You talk about different subjects than I do, clearly, but we both find these kind of different things of learning interesting, because it's something that we're not aware of. It's something that stimulates the mind, and something that you can kind of take back to the water cooler and pretend to be smart for a day or two.
Yeah,
it's a beautiful thing. And people are talking about things that they want to, and they could be themselves, and like-minded people just jump on board because they find you interesting, they like you, and then eventually it just grow from there. So for me, if I could say, being here in a year, I'm kind of new, but if you focus on being yourself, it'll just kind of go along with the punches, and it'll evolve for you. It'll get there. Not to worry.
Yeah. Well, my mic boom will be here soon, and
oh no. You'll be podcasting out in the shed with your lawnmower, whatever it is. If that boom goes far enough, you'll be there. It'll be good.
Yeah.
Podcast in the pool.
I was talking to one podcaster, and he actually created a podcasting, as you say, shed, and he hung all of these blankets and stuff in to get the dampening effect. I mean, now he's really into the technical side of reducing, any background noise. So I get a kick out of that because he sent me a picture of it, and it is just solely designed for this purpose. And he's kind of like in his little shroud as he's doing his podcast. So it's funny, but good content, and I get a kick out of that. That won't be happening down here, by the way. So
I don't know if you're familiar with the Canadian fellow Red Green, but it kind of reminds me of the Possum Lodge.
Yes.
And if people don't know about the Possum Lodge, please look it up. It's one of those great Canadian stereotypes that this gentleman with white beard takes on to a perfect T. And yeah, I think your friend in the shed has a Possum Lodge of podcasting. Perhaps you'll appreciate that.
Well, Elijah, anyway. I just can't thank you enough for today. People listening to this, what's going to happen is I'm going to edit a version of this for the Safety Doc podcast, and then Elijah will take a version of this for Nerdy by Nature. So this collaborative episode. It's the first time I've done this in my 35 episodes. I really enjoyed it, and I think between our two audiences, that this will offer something to both of those audiences.
Definitely. I think so as well. It was a lot of fun, and myself, I haven't done I try to keep my podcasts in half an hour to be fairly succinct in audio, but on YouTube, you have a lot to be able to take on, and we covered a lot of different things in this somewhat short period of time considering. So I think we did well. It's a lot of fun, and maybe we'll get to this soon. Who knows?
Yeah. I definitely think there's going to be a point that our paths will cross again, and maybe we can do another show. I would enjoy that.
For sure. If you ever get to Anaheim or California, I guess it is the big podcasting event. Someday I'll get my gold coins together and save up a trip, but you never know where we'll meet up. That's for sure.
I would love that. And you probably only need Bitcoin at that point.
Well played. You've been paying attention. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Good. Elijah, I wish you and Nerdy by Nature the best. I will continue to, wait anxiously for all of your future episodes and appreciate your time today.
Likewise, David. Thank you. I appreciate doing this and having some fun and be able to get together and realize that we're not that different after all. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.